What are you doing here? This place is not for the poor like you.
They laughed at him in the grocery store parking lot. They laughed at his shoes held together with duct tape, at his wheelchair with the squeaky wheel, at his flannel shirt that had more patches than original fabric. What none of them knew was that in exactly 48 hours, every single person who mocked that old man would be standing in his son's hospital, begging for their jobs, their reputations, and in one case, their freedom. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, we tell real, heartfelt stories about ordinary people who turn out to be extraordinary, about kindness that gets repaid, and about the kind of justice that makes you want to stand up and cheer. If that sounds like your kind of story, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we post new stories every single week. Now, let's get into today's story. Grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and let's begin. In the small town of Millbrook Falls, Ohio, there was a man named Walter Higgins. Walter was 78 years old, and if you passed him on the street, you would never have guessed the life he had lived. He sat in a rusted wheelchair that had seen better decades. His clothes were faded, mismatched, and stitched together in places where the fabric had given up. His white hair stuck out from under a baseball cap that had lost its color somewhere around 1995. To most people in Millbrook Falls, Walter was just the strange old man who sat outside the Northgate Diner every morning, nursing a single cup of black coffee he could barely afford, watching the world go by. Nobody knew his story. Nobody bothered to ask. In a world that moves fast and judges faster, Walter had become invisible, except when people wanted something to laugh at. There was a group of young men who worked at the auto shop down the street, led by a loud, cocky fellow named Tyler Briggs. Tyler was 26, drove a truck that was louder than a jet engine, and had a habit of parking dangerously close to Walter's usual spot outside the diner just to watch him struggle to wheel himself out of the way. Tyler thought it was funny. His friends thought it was funny too. They would toss insults his way, calling him Wheels or Grandpa Rags, and laugh when Walter didn't respond, assuming his silence meant he either couldn't hear them or didn't have the wit to respond. But Walter heard every word. He simply chose not to waste his breath on people who wouldn't understand the answer even if he gave it. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Walter would wheel himself 3 blocks from the small apartment he rented above the hardware store to Northgate Diner. The owner, a kind woman named Dolores Martinez, always saved him the corner booth near the window, the one with the wobbly table leg that nobody else wanted. She never charged him full price for his coffee, though she never told him that. She would ring up 95 cents and pretend that was the total, when really the coffee cost $2.50. It was her small way of taking care of a man the rest of the town had forgotten. "Morning, Walter," she'd say every single day. And every single day he would nod and offer a small, tired smile. "Morning, Dolores. You're a good soul, you know that? So you keep telling me." Nobody knew that Walter had once been an engineer. Nobody knew he had built bridges that still stood in 3 different states, or that he had worked for the government during the height of the Cold War designing infrastructure that protected entire cities. Nobody knew that his late wife, Margaret, had been a nurse who saved hundreds of lives over her 30-year career. And absolutely nobody in Millbrook Falls knew that his son, a man they had never met, was Dr. Nathaniel Higgins, the medical director of St. Augustine Regional Hospital, one of the most respected medical facilities in the entire state of Ohio. Walter and Nathaniel had a complicated relationship, one built on pride, misunderstanding, and years of silence. After Margaret passed away 6 years earlier, something in Walter broke. He stopped taking care of himself the way he used to. He stopped answering Nathaniel's calls as often. He told his son he was fine, that he didn't need help, that he could manage on his own. What he didn't tell Nathaniel was that his pension had been drained by medical bills from Margaret's long illness, that his health had begun failing too, that he had sold most of his belongings just to keep the lights on, and that pride, stubborn old pride, kept him from asking his successful son for a single dime. Nathaniel, for his part, was consumed by his career. He told himself that his father was proud and independent, that pushing too hard would only create distance. He sent checks that Walter never cashed. He called every Sunday, though the calls became shorter and shorter as Walter grew more guarded. Nathaniel didn't know that his father had been using a wheelchair for the past year after a fall that damaged his hip. He didn't know that Walter had been skipping meals to afford his blood pressure medication. He didn't know because Walter had built a wall so high around his struggles that not even his own son could see over it. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Walter wheeled himself down Main Street, the autumn wind biting at his cheeks, his flannel shirt doing little to keep out the chill. As he passed the auto shop, Tyler Briggs and his friends were standing outside, drinking energy drinks and laughing about something on one of their phones. "Well, look who it is," Tyler said, loud enough for Walter to hear. "The mayor of Broketown, everybody." His friends laughed. One of them, a wiry young man named Cody Sanders, made a mocking gesture, pretending to push an invisible wheelchair while hunching over dramatically. Walter kept his eyes forward and continued wheeling toward the diner. He had heard worse. He had lived through worse. Words from foolish young men meant less to him than the ache in his hip that reminded him with every turn of the wheel that his body wasn't what it used to be. But today, something different happened. As Walter approached the curb near the diner, his wheelchair caught on a crack in the sidewalk, and he tipped sideways, spilling onto the pavement. His cap rolled into the gutter. For a moment, he lay there, stunned, the cold concrete pressing against his cheek, his weathered hands scraped and trembling. Instead of rushing to help, several of the onlookers actually laughed. Someone even pulled out their phone to record it. "Oh man, get this, one voice said. It was in that exact moment, as Walter tried to push himself up with shaking arms, that a car pulled sharply into the diner's small parking lot. A woman in pale blue scrubs jumped out before the engine had even fully stopped. Her name was Sarah Coleman, a young trauma nurse who was on her way home after finishing a brutal overnight shift at St. Augustine Regional Hospital. She had seen the fall from half a block away. "Hey! Hey, somebody help this man!" she shouted, sprinting toward Walter and dropping to her knees beside him. "Sir, are you hurt? Can you tell me your name?" I'm fine," Walter mumbled, though the pain in his wrist said otherwise. Sarah gently checked him over, her training kicking in immediately. She noticed the way he favored his right wrist, the slight disorientation in his eyes, the pallor of his skin. "Sir, I think you might have fractured something. I'm a nurse. I work at St. Augustine. We need to get you checked out. I don't have insurance that covers. I can't afford." "That doesn't matter right now," Sarah said firmly, in the tone she used with patients who needed to stop arguing and start listening. "Your safety matters right now." As Sarah helped Walter back into his wheelchair, she turned toward the small crowd that had gathered, some still holding their phones up. "Does anyone want to explain to me why you all just stood there filming instead of helping an elderly man who fell?" Her voice cracked like a whip across the parking lot. Tyler shifted uncomfortably. It happened so fast. "It's been almost 2 minutes," Sarah snapped. "Delete those videos right now, or I swear I will make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of people you are." The crowd dispersed, shame finally catching up to a few of them, though Tyler and his friends simply walked away, muttering under their breath. Sarah loaded Walter into her car, ignoring his weak protests, and drove him straight to St. Augustine Regional Hospital. During the ride, she tried to make conversation, partly to keep him calm and partly to assess his mental clarity after the fall. "So, sir, do you have any family? Anyone we should call?" Walter was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the passing trees, their leaves turning shades of amber and rust. "I have a son," he finally said. "But we don't talk much these days. My fault, mostly. What's his name? Maybe he'd want to know you're at the hospital." Walter hesitated, an old habit of protecting his son from his own struggles kicking in even now. Nathaniel Higgins." Sarah's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, though she said nothing. She assumed it was simply a coincidence, a common enough name. She had no idea, not yet, just how significant that name was about to become. When they arrived at the hospital, Sarah wheeled Walter into the emergency department herself, bypassing the standard intake line because she recognized the early signs of shock. She personally introduced him to a young resident named Dr. Amanda Cruz, explaining what had happened. "Fell outside a diner on Main Street, possible wrist fracture, might have hit his head, elderly male, 78 years old," Sarah rattled off, the clinical language rolling easily off her tongue, despite the exhaustion clearly written across her face after a 16-hour shift. Dr. Cruz nodded, jotting notes onto a tablet. "Got it. Thank you, Sarah. Go home and get some rest. You look dead on your feet." Sarah smiled tiredly, but lingered for a moment, glancing back at Walter, as attendants helped him onto an examination table. Something about the old man's dignity, despite his circumstances, the quiet strength in his eyes, even through obvious pain, stayed with her. "Sir, I hope you feel better soon," she said before turning to leave. "Thank you, young lady," Walter said softly. "You didn't have to stop for an old fool like me." "Nobody's a fool for falling down," Sarah replied. "Take care of yourself." As Dr. Cruz began her examination, she noticed the intake form Sarah had started, specifically the name written under Emergency Contact, son Nathaniel Higgins. Her eyebrows rose slightly, but she said nothing, assuming, as Sarah had, that it was simply a common name shared with the hospital's well-known medical director. It wasn't until nearly an hour later, after X-rays confirmed a hairline fracture in Walter's wrist and doctors were preparing discharge paperwork, that the truth began to surface. A nursing supervisor named Patricia Reyes was reviewing patient charts when she noticed the name on Walter's file. Something about it nagged at her memory. She had worked at St. Augustine for over 15 years, and she vaguely recalled Dr. Higgins mentioning his father's name at a hospital gala years earlier, during a heartfelt speech about the sacrifices his parents made for his education. Patricia walked over to the file, her curiosity piqued, and pulled up Walter's information more carefully. Date of birth, previous occupation listed as civil engineer, retired. Emergency contact, Nathaniel Higgins. Relationship, son. Her heart skipped. She immediately picked up the phone and dialed the medical director's office. "Dr. Higgins' office. This is Jennifer speaking." "Jennifer, it's Patricia from the ER. I need to speak with Dr. Higgins immediately. It's urgent." Nathaniel Higgins was 52 years old, a man who carried himself with the calm authority of someone who had spent decades making life-or-death decisions. His silver-streaked hair and perfectly tailored suits made him look every bit the distinguished medical director that he was. But underneath that polished exterior was a son who had spent the last several years quietly worrying about a father who refused to let anyone help him. When Jennifer transferred the call, explaining only that it was urgent and hospital-related, Nathaniel assumed it was some administrative crisis, a budget issue, or a staffing shortage. Nothing could have prepared him for what Patricia was about to tell him. "Dr. Higgins, I'm so sorry to bother you, but we have a patient in the ER, an elderly gentleman named Walter Higgins. He fell outside a diner and was brought in with a wrist fracture. I noticed his name, and I wanted to check with you before we proceeded further. Is this your father?" The room seemed to tilt around Nathaniel. His pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto his desk. "Say that again," he said, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Walter Higgins, sir. 78 years old. He's in exam room 6. Nathaniel was already standing, already moving toward the door before Patricia had finished her sentence. "Don't discharge him. Don't let anyone move him. I'm coming down right now." He nearly ran through the hospital corridors, something the composed, always professional medical director had never done in his 15 years at St. Augustine. Staff members stopped and stared as he sprinted past, his tie flapping over his shoulder, his usual measured pace replaced by something raw and desperate. When Nathaniel burst into exam room 6, he found his father sitting on the edge of the examination table, his wrist wrapped in a temporary splint, wearing that same faded flannel shirt, those same worn-out shoes. For a moment, neither man said anything. Nathaniel simply stared, taking in every detail he had missed over months of distant phone calls, the weight his father had lost, the exhaustion etched into his face, the wheelchair folded up in the corner of the room that he hadn't even known his father needed. "Dad?" Nathaniel finally whispered, his voice breaking. "Dad, what happened to you?" Walter looked up, and for the first time in a long time, the mask of stubborn independence cracked. "Nathaniel," he said softly, "I didn't want you to see me like this." "See you like what?" "Dad, you're in a wheelchair. You fell in the street. Why didn't you call me? Why didn't you tell me any of this?" Tears welled in Walter's eyes, decades of pride finally giving way. "Because I was ashamed. I was the one who taught you that a man takes care of his own problems. I couldn't call my son, the big important doctor, and tell him his father couldn't even afford his own medication. I couldn't do that to you. I couldn't do that to your mother's memory." Nathaniel crossed the room in 2 steps and pulled his father into his arms, careful of the injured wrist, holding him the way he hadn't in years. "You listen to me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are not a burden. You are my father. You built half the bridges in this state. You raised me. You and Mom sacrificed everything so I could go to medical school. Do you understand what would have happened if Sarah hadn't found you today? If nobody had stopped to help you?" Walter said nothing, simply gripping his son's arm with his good hand. "I'm ashamed," Nathaniel continued, "not of you, never of you, but of myself. I let my career distract me from checking on you the way I should have. I sent checks instead of showing up. I called instead of visiting. That ends today." Word spread through St. Augustine Regional Hospital like wildfire. Within the hour, nearly every staff member on shift knew that the disheveled elderly man who had been quietly brought into the ER was, in fact, the father of the hospital's medical director. Nurses who had walked past exam room 6 without a second glance suddenly found reasons to check in. Doctors who had never met Walter suddenly wanted to personally oversee his care, but the story didn't stay contained within the hospital walls for long. Sarah Coleman, exhausted but unable to sleep after everything that happened, had mentioned the incident to her roommate, who happened to work at the local news station. What started as a small human interest piece about a good Samaritan nurse helping a fallen elderly man quickly transformed into something much bigger once the connection to Dr. Higgins became public. By that evening, the local news was running a story titled, "Beloved Medical Director's Father Found Fallen and Ignored on Main Street. Nurse's Quick Action Saves the Day." The story included, much to Nathaniel's controlled fury, a brief mention that bystanders had laughed and filmed instead of helping. The story exploded across social media within Millbrook Falls and beyond. Comments poured in from residents expressing outrage at the treatment Walter had received, not just that day, but seemingly for months, as more people came forward with their own accounts of witnessing the mockery Walter endured outside the diner and auto shop. Tyler Briggs, whose face had been partially visible in one of the videos that hadn't been deleted in time, found himself at the center of intense public backlash. His employer, the owner of the auto shop, received hundreds of angry messages and calls demanding Tyler's termination. Comments flooded in from people who recognized him, who had seen him mock the old man on other occasions, who had simply never said anything until now. 2 days after the incident, Tyler was called into his boss's office. "Tyler, I've known you since you were 16 years old, working weekends to earn gas money," his boss, a gruff but fair man named Frank Delgado, said. "But I can't have my shop associated with what happened. Customers are canceling appointments. People are saying they won't bring their cars here anymore because of what you did to that old man. Frank, come on. It was just messing around. We didn't mean any harm." "Didn't mean any harm?" Frank's voice rose. "Tyler, that man fell on the ground in front of you, and your buddies were filming it for laughs instead of helping him up. Do you understand what kind of person that makes you look like? What kind of person that makes you?" Tyler had no response. "I'm going to need you to take some time off," Frank continued. "Indefinitely. I can't have this hanging over the shop." Tyler left the auto shop that day with his career and reputation in shambles, a stark contrast to the swaggering young man who had mocked an old man just 72 hours earlier. Meanwhile, inside St. Augustine Regional Hospital, something remarkable was happening. Nathaniel had insisted his father stay for a full evaluation, not just for the wrist fracture, but for the malnutrition, the untreated hypertension, and the early signs of depression that had gone unnoticed for far too long. He personally arranged for the hospital's best specialists to examine his father, cutting through red tape with the authority only a medical director possessed. But more than the medical care, it was the human connection that mattered most. Nathaniel spent every spare moment at his father's bedside, something the hospital staff had never seen from their typically busy medical director. He canceled meetings. He rescheduled surgeries he wasn't personally performing. For the first time in years, Nathaniel Higgins put his father before his career. "I've been thinking," Walter said on the second night, as Nathaniel sat beside his hospital bed reading through paperwork, "about your mother." Nathaniel looked up. "What about her?" "She always said pride was going to be the thing that finally got me. She used to tell me, 'Walter, one day that stubbornness of yours is going to cost you something you can't get back.' I think she was talking about this. About us. About the years we lost because I was too proud to tell you I was struggling. We haven't lost them, Dad. We're right here, right now. I know, Walter said, reaching for his son's hand. And I don't want to waste whatever time we have left being stubborn old fools. Either one of us. The story of Walter Higgins continued to spread, but it began shifting from outrage towards something more meaningful, a broader conversation about how society treats elderly people, particularly those who appear to be struggling financially or physically. Local churches and community organizations reached out to the hospital, asking how they could help. A grassroots movement began forming around Millbrook Falls to check on elderly residents who might be quietly struggling the way Walter had been. Dolores Martinez, the diner owner who had been quietly giving Walter discounted coffee for years, was interviewed by the local news and became something of a local hero herself once people learned about her small acts of kindness. "I didn't do it for recognition," she told the reporter, wiping tears from her eyes. "Walter is a good man. He always tipped what he could, even when it wasn't much. He always said thank you like he meant it. That's more than I can say for a lot of my customers who have plenty of money." Sarah Coleman, the nurse who had stopped to help, received a formal commendation from the hospital board, along with a substantial recognition award that Nathaniel personally insisted upon. But when presented with the award during a hospital ceremony 2 weeks later, Sarah redirected the moment entirely. "I appreciate this," she said, standing at the podium in front of hospital staff and local media. "But I want to be clear about something. What I did wasn't heroic. It was basic human decency." The fact that it's being treated as extraordinary says something troubling about how we as a society have started treating vulnerable people, especially the elderly. I hope this story makes people think twice before walking past someone who needs help, regardless of who their family is or what they look like. Her words resonated deeply, being quoted in follow-up articles and shared thousands of times online. As for Tyler Briggs, something unexpected happened about 3 weeks after the incident. Nathaniel, despite his initial fury toward the young man, found himself thinking about second chances, about how his own father had always believed in redemption over punishment. He requested a meeting with Tyler, one that surprised everyone involved, including his own hospital staff who expected Nathaniel to want nothing to do with the man who had mocked his father. They met at a small coffee shop, not the diner where the incident occurred. Tyler arrived nervous, expecting anger, perhaps even legal threats. "I'm not here to yell at you," Nathaniel began. "I've done enough of that in my head over the past few weeks. I'm here because my father, despite everything, asked me to find you." Tyler blinked in confusion. "Your father wants to see me?" He said something to me that stuck. He said, "Nathaniel, that boy is young and foolish, but foolishness isn't a life sentence. Someone should tell him that before he becomes the kind of man who never learns." Tyler's eyes welled up unexpectedly. "I've lost my job. People look at me like I'm a monster when I walk down the street. I deserve it, I know I do, but I don't know how to fix what I did." "You start," Nathaniel said, "by actually seeing people. All people, not just the ones who look successful or put together. My father spent 30 years building bridges that connected communities. What you did was the opposite of that. You built a wall between yourself and basic compassion. But walls can come down if you're willing to do the work." Nathaniel arranged for Tyler to spend time volunteering at a senior center in Millbrook Falls, an unconventional form of accountability that surprised the entire community. Over the following months, something in Tyler genuinely began to shift. He learned the names and stories of the elderly residents he worked with. He heard about their lives, their sacrifices, their loneliness. Slowly, painfully, he began to understand the humanity he had failed to see in Walter that day outside the diner. 6 months after the incident, Walter Higgins had regained much of his strength, both physically and emotionally. He had moved into a small guest house on Nathaniel's property, close enough for regular visits, but independent enough to preserve his dignity. His wrist had healed completely, and with proper medical care and nutrition, his overall health had improved dramatically. Dolores still saved him his favorite corner booth every Tuesday and Thursday, though now Nathaniel often joined him, the two of them talking and laughing in a way that hadn't happened in years. The wobbly table leg had finally been fixed, a small gesture from Dolores that meant more to Walter than she probably realized. On the 1-year anniversary of the fall, St. Augustine Regional Hospital held a community event focused on elderly care awareness, something Walter himself helped organize. Standing at the podium, Leaning slightly on a cane rather than needing his wheelchair full-time now, Walter addressed a crowd that included many of the same people who had once laughed at him in that parking lot. "A year ago," he began, his voice steady and clear, "I fell down on a sidewalk not far from here. Some people laughed. Some people filmed it instead of helping, and I want to say, I understand why. We live in a world that has taught us to see certain people as less important, less worthy of our time and attention. Old age, poverty, disability, these things make us invisible to a society obsessed with success and appearances." The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. "But here's what I've learned. Every single person you pass on the street has a story you know nothing about. The old man in torn clothes might have built the bridge you drive across every day. The woman struggling to carry her groceries might have raised 5 children on her own. The person you're quick to judge might be carrying a weight you can't even imagine." Walter paused, looking directly at Tyler, who stood near the back of the crowd, now working full-time at the senior center rather than the auto shop, a transformation nobody in Millbrook Falls could have predicted a year earlier. "I don't say this to shame anyone," Walter continued. "I say this because I believe people can change. I've watched it happen right in front of me this past year. What I ask of every single one of you is simple. The next time you see someone who looks like they're struggling, whether they're in a wheelchair, wearing torn clothes, or simply sitting alone, take a moment, say hello. Ask if they need help. You never know whose father, whose mother, whose grandparent you might be looking at. And even if they're nobody's medical director's father, they still deserve your kindness, simply because they're human." The applause that followed was thunderous, but more meaningful than the applause was what happened in the weeks and months that followed throughout Millbrook Falls. Neighbors began checking on elderly residents more regularly. The senior center saw an increase in volunteers. Small acts of kindness, holding doors, offering rides, simply stopping to talk, became slightly more common in a town that had learned a hard lesson about the cost of indifference. Nathaniel and Walter's relationship, once strained by years of misplaced pride and distance, became closer than it had ever been. They had Sunday dinners together every single week without fail. Nathaniel made sure his father knew, through actions rather than just words, that he would never again have to face hardship alone out of fear of being a burden. "You know," Walter said one evening, sitting on the porch of his guest house as autumn leaves fell around them, much like they had the day he fell outside the diner a year earlier. "Sometimes the worst moments in our lives end up leading us to the best ones." "How do you mean?" Nathaniel asked. "If I hadn't fallen that day, if that young nurse hadn't stopped to help, we might still be living our separate lives. You buried in your work, me too proud to ask for help. Sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom to remind us what actually matters." Nathaniel nodded, understanding the weight of his father's words. "I promise you, Dad, we're never going back to how things were before. No more distance, no more pride getting in the way." Walter smiled, the kind of genuine, peaceful smile that had been missing from his face for far too long. "That's all I ever wanted, son. Not your money, not your success. Just you." Now, before we wrap up today's story, I want to take a moment to talk directly to you, our viewers. If there's one thing this story teaches us, it's that we should never judge people by their appearance, their circumstances, or what they seem to have or not have. The elderly man sitting alone at the diner, the person struggling with their groceries, the neighbor who seems to be going through a hard time, take a moment to show them kindness. You genuinely never know the impact one small act of compassion can have, not just on their life, but on your own. If you have elderly parents or grandparents, call them today. Not tomorrow, not next week. Today. Life is unpredictable, and the time we have with the people we love is more precious than any career achievement or personal pride. Don't let stubbornness or busyness create distance between you and the people who matter most. If this story touched your heart the way it touched ours while creating it, please give this video a like. It genuinely helps our channel grow and allows us to keep bringing you these meaningful stories every single week. Drop a comment below and let us know what part of Walter's story impacted you the most. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss one of our uploads. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. We'll see you in the next story. Take care of yourselves, and more importantly, take care of each other.